There are certain relationships that don't just feel difficult, they feel emotionally exhausting on a deeper level. People often find themselves trapped in connections that drain them, confuse them, and slowly break their inner balance. But among all of these toxic dynamics, one of the most intense and complicated is when an empath falls in love with a narcissist. This pairing is often described as one of the most unstable emotional combinations, almost like two forces moving in opposite directions that were never meant to align. It's not simply a clash of personalities, it's a clash of inner worlds. Like parallel lines that run endlessly side by side but never truly meet, their emotional realities remain fundamentally different. Empaths are often misunderstood. Many assume they are fragile, overly sensitive, or easily broken. But the truth is far more complex. Empaths are deeply resilient individuals who carry emotional weight that most people would struggle to endure. They absorb the feelings of those around them, often without realizing it. They notice pain where others overlook it, and they feel responsible for easing it. Despite this heavy emotional responsibility, they continue moving forward. They don't collapse easily, instead, they persist, often silently holding together not just their own emotions, but the emotional struggles of others as well. They are natural healers in many ways. Empaths often step into the role of emotional caretakers, trying to understand, comfort, and repair those who are hurting. They are deeply uncomfortable when they see others in distress, and this discomfort pushes them to act, to help, to fix, to support. In many cases, they even place the needs of others above their own well-being, pouring their energy into people who seem to need healing. However, this same compassionate nature becomes their greatest vulnerability when a narcissist enters their life. Narcissists are not drawn to empaths by accident. They are often attracted to the warmth, patience, and emotional generosity that empaths naturally carry. But their intentions are very different. Instead of seeking mutual emotional growth or healing, narcissists often seek validation, control, and emotional supply. They do not approach the empath because they need healing, they approach because they see access to unconditional emotional energy. When an empath lacks strong emotional boundaries or self-protection, they can easily become overwhelmed. Instead of maintaining their own emotional identity, they begin to absorb the narcissist's emotional patterns, manipulations, and energy drains. They become like sponges, unconsciously soaking up negativity while continuously trying to fix something that was never broken in the way they believe. The core issue in this dynamic is contrast. Empaths are driven by compassion and healing energy. They feel compelled to ease suffering wherever they find it. Narcissists, on the other hand, often exploit that very compassion. They recognize the empath's willingness to give, and instead of reciprocating, they use it as a resource. What begins as emotional connection quickly turns into emotional imbalance. The empath keeps giving, understanding, and forgiving, while the narcissist continues to take, demand, and manipulate. Over time, the empath may start to lose clarity about what is healthy and what is harmful because their desire to help becomes stronger than their ability to protect themselves. In many cases, the narcissist is not seeking emotional repair. They are not entering the relationship with the intention of mutual growth or healing. Instead, they often seek control over the emotional environment. They may subtly undermine the empath's confidence, distort their perception of reality, or make them feel responsible for problems they did not create. And yet, despite all of this complexity, these relationships rarely begin in chaos. In fact, they often start in the most beautiful and emotionally intense way. At the beginning, everything feels almost magical. There is deep attraction, emotional intensity, and a sense of being deeply understood. The connection can feel unusually powerful, almost as if both individuals have finally found someone who completes them in a unique way. The empath feels seen and the narcissist feels admired. It is a phase filled with excitement, emotional highs, and a strong sense of connection that can feel almost addictive. But over time, the initial charm begins to shift. The emotional balance slowly changes, often so subtly that the empath doesn't immediately notice it. What once felt like connection can gradually turn into confusion. Moments of warmth may begin to alternate with moments of emotional distance or manipulation, creating an unstable rhythm in the relationship. The empath, driven by their natural instinct to heal and understand, often tries harder. They try to restore the original harmony, believing that with enough patience, love, and effort, things can return to how they were in the beginning. But what they are trying to fix is not a temporary misunderstanding, it is a deeply imbalanced emotional structure. This is where the struggle intensifies, because the empath's strength, empathy, becomes the very pathway through which they get emotionally entangled. They give more in hopes of healing the relationship while gradually losing more of themselves in the process. And this is only the beginning of what unfolds when an empath loves a narcissist, a dynamic that continues to reveal deeper emotional consequences as the relationship progresses under empath's psychology. At the very beginning, it often feels like something out of thin air, almost unreal. This kind of intense emotional start is common in many new relationships, but when an empath falls in love with a narcissist, it takes on an entirely different level of intensity. Everything feels amplified, almost dreamlike. The commitment and affection appear extraordinary from the very start. The empath gives love with complete sincerity, holding nothing back. They don't love halfway, they love fully, deeply, and without hesitation or complaint. Their nature is to pour into others without expecting much in return, and when they finally direct that energy toward one person they believe in, it becomes overwhelming in its intensity. On the other hand, narcissists are often deeply self-focused. They carry a strong sense of self-importance and constantly seek validation and emotional supply from others. While they crave attention and affection, they are not always willing to offer the same level of emotional depth in return. Yet this is exactly where the empath becomes central to the dynamic. The empath naturally gives love to many people in their life, often without feeling drained. But when they fall in love, all of that emotional energy becomes concentrated on one individual. That's what makes the beginning of this relationship feel so powerful, almost like a long-awaited emotional answer for both sides. The narcissist feels admired and desired in a way that feeds their ego, while the empath feels deeply connected and emotionally fulfilled. Another reason the beginning feels so electrifying is because of the effort imbalance. At first, narcissists often put in just enough effort to capture the empath's attention. These small gestures, although minimal, feel meaningful to the empath because they are interpreted through a lens of trust and emotional hope. The empath, guided by their belief in genuine connection, overlooks early warning signs and instead leans into what they believe could be real love. This is also the stage where the highest level of emotional exploitation can begin, often without the empath even realizing it. The narcissist slowly learns what the empath values: kindness, understanding, patience, and begins to use those traits to strengthen attachment. Since the empath is naturally forgiving and compassionate, they tend to rationalize inconsistencies, believing love will eventually balance everything out. As the relationship progresses, a subtle but powerful shift begins: control. Narcissists often desire control in relationships, even if they don't openly express it. They want to become the emotional center, the dominant influence, the one the empath depends on. In the early stages, they may subtly shape this dependency by making the empath feel uniquely chosen, as if no one else could possibly offer the same connection. The empath, trusting and emotionally open, may begin to internalize this idea. Over time, they become more emotionally invested, sometimes even accepting imbalance as normal. This deepening attachment makes it harder to recognize manipulation for what it is. Eventually, tension begins to surface. Even the most understanding heart has limits. When an empath repeatedly feels unheard, undervalued, or emotionally neglected, exhaustion begins to build. Their patience is not infinite. Although they are naturally compassionate, they are not immune to emotional pain. When pushed too far, empaths may begin to assert themselves more strongly. They start expressing their needs, setting boundaries, or reacting to emotional neglect. From the outside, this shift can appear sudden or even unlike them, but in reality, it is the result of prolonged emotional strain. This is where conflict often escalates. The empath, after long periods of imbalance, may begin to resemble traits they never had before: more guarded, more reactive, more self-protective. But instead of recognizing this as a response to emotional exhaustion, the narcissist may interpret it as selfishness or irrational behavior. This misunderstanding deepens the divide, making resolution increasingly difficult. At this stage, neither side feels fully heard. Accountability becomes rare and reconciliation becomes harder to reach. The emotional distance continues to grow and conflicts become more frequent and intense. Then comes the breaking point. When the relationship eventually ends, the emotional aftermath is especially heavy for the empath. Even though they may not be the ones at fault, they often carry a deep sense of responsibility for what went wrong. Their natural tendency to reflect, analyze, and empathize becomes a burden in itself. The words and emotional patterns used by the narcissist during the relationship often linger in the empath's mind. These internalized messages can create confusion, self-doubt, and guilt. The empath may replay conversations, question their decisions, and wonder if they could have done more to fix things. Even when the relationship was unhealthy, the empath may still feel as though they failed in some way because their nature is to heal, not to abandon. And this emotional residue can stay with them long after the relationship ends, shaping how they see love, trust, and themselves moving forward under empath's psychology. One of the most painful realizations for an empath after a breakup is the belief that they were the problem all along. Even when the relationship was filled with imbalance, emotional manipulation, and constant giving from one side, the empath often turns inward. They start questioning their own actions, wondering if they were too demanding, too sensitive, or somehow responsible for the failure of the relationship. This self-blame is not random. It is often the result of repeated emotional conditioning throughout the relationship. Narcissistic behavior can be deeply damaging in subtle ways. Through harsh words, guilt-tripping, and emotional distortion, the empath may begin to believe they are the ones who caused the damage. In some cases, the internal dialogue becomes so distorted that they feel unworthy, even convinced they were too much for simply expressing their needs. But in reality, the pattern of fault rarely begins with the empath. Instead, what often happens is a gradual transfer of blame. The narcissist's influence can shape the empath's perception over time, making them question their own emotional reality. What was once clear becomes confusing, and what was once self-trust slowly turns into self-doubt. Another core pattern in this dynamic is the imbalance of giving and taking. In these relationships, one person continuously gives while the other continuously takes. The empath offers emotional support, understanding, patience, and unconditional care. The narcissist, on the other hand, often receives this energy while contributing far less in return. Over time, this becomes a repeating cycle, almost like a system that looks balanced on the surface but is deeply unequal underneath. At first, this imbalance may not feel harmful. In fact, it can appear comforting or even natural. The empath feels fulfilled by giving, and the narcissist feels satisfied by receiving. On the surface, it may even seem like a perfect match, two people filling each other's emotional roles. But this perceived balance is misleading. The empath naturally leans towards serving, supporting, and healing others. Their sense of love is expressed through giving. The narcissist, however, often leans toward being served, validated, and emotionally prioritized. This creates a dynamic where both roles are reinforced, but not in a healthy or mutual way. To the empath, especially in the early stages, this can feel like purpose. It can feel like they have finally found someone to care for deeply, someone to invest in completely. It may even feel like destiny, like they are fulfilling a role they were meant to play, to heal, to support, to love unconditionally. But over time, a critical question begins to emerge. How long can someone continue giving without receiving genuine appreciation in return? Narcissists often struggle with expressing gratitude in a meaningful or consistent way. Instead of acknowledging effort as something valuable, they may begin to see it as expected. Over time, what was once kindness becomes obligation in their eyes. The empath's constant effort is no longer appreciated, it is assumed. This is where emotional exhaustion begins to build quietly. What once felt like love slowly turns into imbalance. The empath continues to give, hoping things will improve, hoping recognition will come, hoping emotional reciprocity will eventually appear. But instead, the cycle repeats, reinforcing the same dynamic over and over again. Eventually, the empath reaches a breaking point, not always loudly, but internally. A space where emotional fatigue, confusion, and self-doubt begin to outweigh the desire to keep giving. And that is the hidden truth behind this kind of relationship. What looks like harmony from the outside is often an uneven exchange of emotional energy underneath. One person becomes the constant giver, and the other becomes the constant receiver. So when people reflect on this dynamic, it raises an important question for empath psychology. Is this really love, or just a cycle of emotional imbalance disguised as connection? In conclusion, the dynamic between an empath and a narcissist is one of the most emotionally intense and misunderstood relationship patterns. At first glance, it can appear powerful, even destined. The empath brings depth, compassion, patience, and unconditional emotional investment, while the narcissist often brings charm, intensity, and a strong initial sense of attention that feels magnetic and consuming. But beneath that surface attraction lies a deeper imbalance that slowly reveals itself over time. What begins as connection gradually turns into a one-sided emotional exchange. The empath continues to give love, understanding, forgiveness, and emotional support, often believing that enough care and patience can heal the relationship. Meanwhile, the narcissist becomes increasingly dependent on receiving without offering the same level of emotional reciprocity in return. This creates a cycle where giving and taking are no longer balanced, even if it once felt that way in the beginning. As the relationship progresses, emotional confusion begins to replace clarity. The empath starts questioning their own feelings, their boundaries, and even their worth. Because of the subtle manipulation, blame shifting, and emotional distortion that can occur in such dynamics, the empath may begin to internalize responsibility for problems they did not fully create. This is where the deepest damage often happens, not just in the relationship itself, but in how the empath begins to see themselves. Eventually, exhaustion becomes unavoidable. Even the most patient and understanding heart reaches its limit when emotional needs are consistently ignored or invalidated. The empath, who once believed they were healing the relationship through love, begins to realize that love alone cannot fix a deeply imbalanced emotional structure. At that point, the relationship either collapses or becomes emotionally unsustainable. After the breakup, the aftermath is often heavier for the empath than the narcissist. The empath may carry guilt, confusion, and self-blame, replaying moments and wondering what they could have done differently. This lingering emotional weight is not a reflection of failure, but rather a reflection of how deeply they invested in trying to make something work that was not equally shared. Ultimately, this kind of relationship teaches a difficult but powerful truth. Empathy without boundaries becomes self-sacrifice, and love without reciprocity becomes emotional depletion. The empath's ability to care so deeply is not a weakness, it is a strength. But when it is placed in the wrong dynamic, it can turn into a source of pain instead of connection. The real lesson is not to stop loving, but to learn how to protect that love, to recognize when care is mutual and when it is being taken for granted, and to understand that true emotional connection is not defined by how much one person can endure, but by how equally both people are willing to give, respect, and grow together. In the end, healing for the empath begins when they stop trying to save relationships that are built on imbalance and start choosing relationships that honor their emotional depth instead of draining it.